In 9.1 Part C, we're going to look at errors. What if we make a mistake on these significance tests? So in a jury trial, what two errors can they make? Well, we've talked about their decisions. If they, number one, found them guilty, but they were wrong, then the person is really innocent. That's a problem, right? They found them guilty, but they're really innocent. And the other one is they found them not guilty, but they really are guilty. Now in this situation, the first statement is what we call a type 1 error. The second is a type 2 error. All right? So in a significance test, same two errors, and here's how it works out. A type 1 error means that you found evidence that the alternative is true when it really isn't true. Okay? You found evidence that the alternative is true, but it really isn't, meaning you rejected the null hypothesis. Okay? A type 2 error is the opposite. You do not find evidence that the alternative is true, but it really is. In this case, that you made a conclusion where you failed to reject. So then, which one would be worse? Well, typically, a type 2 error is worse. And not always, but typically it is a worse scenario. For instance, you told someone they were not guilty, but they really were. You're leaving a criminal out in public. That's a problem, right? It's a danger to society. So there's more damage usually with a type 2 error than a type 1. Now, how do I keep this straight? Well, I keep it straight because type 2 happens when we fail to reject the null. Okay? We fail to reject it. The twos go together, if you will. So it says to describe a type 1 and type 2 error in the context of the brand name versus generic potato chip example from last video. Which error would the students have made? And explain. So it's really important when you're defining the errors that you refer back to what's the null and what's the alternative. So the type 1 error is when we rejected the null. So think about the wording when you reject the null. That you found evidence, right? Found evidence of the alternative. So here's how I would word my error. Finding evidence that the true proportion of students who prefer brand name chips is greater than 50% when it really is less than 50%. So this last phrase is just the opposite, right? And where did I get this? I defined the alternative right here. That's where the greater than came from. But the truth was, it's the opposite. It's less than. So a type 2 error is when we failed to reject. So we did not find evidence, again, of the alternative. So we say, not finding evidence that the true proportion of students who prefer brand name chips is greater than 50%, when it really is greater than 50%. Okay? Okay, few last questions. So what's the probability of making a type 1 error? Well, a type 1 error is finding the probability that we rejected the null given that the null is true. And what we find is that that is equal to the alpha level, the significance level of your test. Okay? Rejecting the null given the null is true. It's a conditional probability. So a probability of type 1 error is your significance level. Could be 5%, 10%, 1%, whatever. So what can we do to reduce the probability of a type 1 error? Well, if we want to reduce that, we must demand that the evidence be very, very convincing in order to reject the null. Okay? So for instance, if I'm doing a murder trial, that would require, I want serious evidence. So I require 1,000 eyewitnesses to this murder before I can find someone guilty. That's pretty strict, but it would reduce your type 1 error quite a bit if you made your conditions very strict, meaning you made your significance level very small. Now, are there drawbacks to this? Well, yeah. If you make it harder to reject the null, meaning you make it harder to make a type 1 error, that means you're going to make it more likely to make a type 2 error. And we'll look at this more in the next section. But they're not complements of one another, but they are related, and I'll show you that in the next one. But that's the drawback. If you make it harder to make a type 1, you are inevitably making it more likely that you're making a type 2 error. So you have to be careful.